Good morning to everybody. I am Sylvester Ogbechie. Let me begin by thanking Sarah Van Beurden, Chair, for inviting me to serve as respondent to this panel and to congratulate her co-panelists, Laura De Becker and Janine Sistma, for their insightful presentations. The issue of how postcolonial African politics impacts African art is central to any interpretation of Africa's location in discourses of contemporaneity, especially within a context of neoliberal narratives of a globalized art world that too easily dismisses the African struggle to carve out a space where its art embraces and affirms its particular location in global culture. In the last half of the 20th century, this struggle preoccupied contemporary African artists and framed various efforts to create a contemporary African art that unfolded in full awareness of Africa's fraught history of colonization. The papers presented here engage different contexts of this effort, and they show in their diversity that the struggle to define a postcolonial African art is an ongoing and messy process. Janine Sistma's paper tackles one of the principal protocols of postcolonial African art, which is the formalistic and ideological structuring of art movements mostly centered around specific art schools, aided by the simple fact that the majority of relevant postcolonial African artists worked as teachers. In her study of the development of art courses at the University of Ife, Sistma argues that the university initiated art courses through its Institute of African Studies, framed through an education rather than a general fine arts curriculum. This unique background, she argues, confers a distinct African orientation to the program from its beginning, which she claims is substantially different in its focus from other Nigerian art schools and movements. Sistma contends that scholarship on art movements and art schools in Nigeria has to date mostly focused on the University of Nigeria and Nsukka's art school and on the Uli revivalist movement it spawned. Her analysis of the University of Ife Art School intends to develop a balanced history and correct a common misconception that Ife's Department of Fine Arts was modeled after that of UNN rather than evolving from Ife's Institute of African Studies. Sistma's focus on Ife is commendable, and she is indeed correct that most scholarship on art movements in Nigerian art focus too much on Zaria and Nsukka, the former as site of the premier student rebellion against British colonial tutelage, and the latter site as one of the most successful ideological movements of modern Nigerian art. We need more histories of important art schools and movements in Africa, and Sistma provides a framework for engaging such history here. She runs into problems, however, in her reading of this history, mainly in the effort to carve out an autonomous domain of practice for the University of Ife Art School. First, she makes an unsubstantiated claim of a common misconception that the art department of the University of Ife was modeled after that of UNN. It would have been useful if she cited someone who makes this claim as a means of refuting it. Secondly, her assertion that artists at the University of Ife developed a distinct modern Yoruba art misreads the overall project of postcolonial artistic practice in Nigeria and falls prey to what I call movementism, the assertion of radical difference that claims undue uniqueness for general contemporary practice. One might argue that there is no such thing as contemporary Yoruba art or contemporary Igbo art for that matter, as claimed by the Nsukka School exponents, if by this term one defines a contemporary art form operating within the gallery system that carries on and centers ethnically circumscribed indigenous cultural production. There was considerable ideological appropriation of Yoruba hermeneutics in the cultural orientation of the University of Ife, as with other Nigerian art schools. But the art produced reflected a basic modernist aesthetic in both form and concept. The key difference between traditional and modern African art is that one is very much invested in the affective abilities of art, while the other, that is modern art, unfolds within an ideological framework that effectively delinks art from indigenous modes of affect. Indigenous art almost always does something, which is not the case with modern art, however much we try to link it to indigenous antecedents. In fact, the principal effort to create a Yoruba-inspired art at Ife, what later became known as Onaism, is more appropriately defined as localized interpretation of the ideal of natural synthesis, and its modernist history can be seen in the fact that it unfolded within an Ife culture that very much carried on a millennia-long history of indigenous cultural representation, from which the modernist experiments of the Oriolokun school and other such Ife art school-related developments were very much divorced. More importantly, SISTMA overlooks the fact that the Institute of African Studies was interested in an art focus from its earliest phase. The most important Nigerian artist of the day, Ben Enwonwu, was appointed the first professor of fine art in Nigeria by the Institute of African Studies at Ife and was a resident professor there from 1971 to 1976. His impact is at least worthy of examination. SISTMA similarly asserts that participants in the Oriolokun Club had little, if any, previous formal training. This statement disregards the fact that many of these individuals were accomplished traditional artists and performers who came to their crafts through rigorous indigenous systems of training, which is often overlooked in discussions of their backgrounds. One imagines that a fuller working out of SISTMA's research will engage the extensive discussions extant on the characteristics, roles, and functions of art schools in modern Nigerian art, which is at this point quite substantial. Sarah Van Beurden's paper is a bold investigation into a fraught effort to create an authentic African post-colonial culture for Zaire through deployment of a national museum. The struggle for ownership of its indigenous cultural heritage is one of the principal sites of contention for post-colonial Africa. Colonial culture looted vast swaths of African culture and relocated them to major museums in the colonial metropole. The struggle to repatriate Africa's stolen culture has so far been unfruitful, and the attendant issue of how to frame and display what remains in Africa is equally problematic. Van Beurden's analysis of efforts by the Zaire dictator John Desire Mobutu, also known as Mobutu Sese Seko, to nationalize traditional culture through the Zaire Institute for National Museums, IMNZ, is therefore bold and refreshing. It is hard to find anything positive to say about Mobutu's disastrous rule in Zaire, but it is disingenuous to efface his considerable devotion to a spectacle of indigenization framed through an ideology of authenticity. For the record, let us agree that Mobutu was a tyrant who misruled Zaire, also known as the Democratic Republic of Congo, and who caused no end of suffering for his traumatized population. His misrule represents the nadir of American odiousness in the support he received from successive American presidents over a period of more than 3 decades, mainly for delivering the vast natural resources of the Congo to rapacious American corporations for brutal exploitation. However, it is easy to forget that Mobutu's rhetoric of post-colonial authenticity channeled the raw energy of post-colonial African aspiration, which in Zaire produced a notable and unique art form in Soukous music, which remains Zaire's greatest contribution to post-colonial African and global culture. Soukous continues to fascinate lovers of music everywhere, and it illustrates in stark fashion the African adage that one can learn even from the most diabolical circumstance. Van Beurden acknowledges the international success of IMNZ and its display of Zairean cultural sovereignty through the Institute's widely successful Art from Zaire exhibition, which toured 9 African venues from 1975 to 78. She, however, concludes that the exhibition shows us that authenticity failed in its ambition to create a new aesthetic vision. It had little effect on the ways objects were displayed or conceptualized or contextualized, which relied heavily on Western paradigms of art display. And that's a quote. Her conclusion raises the question of whether there is any alternative protocol of art display in museums beyond the established paradigm. The museum system, with its structured representation, with its structured protocols of discourse and display, represents a formidable Western ideology of representation and a key marker of Western power in the age of Eurocentric hegemony. The amount of power vested in museum display protocols compels us to acknowledge simply that the museum is an ideology of representation that pretty much precludes alternatives. Laura de Becker traces the history of the National Museum of Rwanda, the NMR, from the colonial to post-colonial contexts and uses this to investigate the role of arts and culture in creating a post-genocide Rwandan national identity. She notes that although the destruction of or deliberate targeting of cultural heritage is a method and tactic commonly used during acts of genocide, the National Museum of Rwanda managed to elude destruction and is still a functioning museum in the country today. Her presentation therefore examines, among other things, the NMR's centrality to efforts to reimagine a post-colonial and post-genocide nation, the display of Africa's looted cultural patrimony in Western museums, and in African museums for that matter, as Van Beurden shows above, has mainly classified African art objects according to perceived ethnic identities, which are perceived as rigid and exclusionary. The Rwandan genocide narrates one of the worst after effects of Africa's colonization, the cementing of fluid ethnic identities into concrete and divisive forms that undermined indigenous African constructions of identity. Rigidified ethnic identities locked post-colonial Africans into an unbreakable cycle of interethnic violence, which in Rwanda resulted in slaughter on a grand scale as Hutu and Tutsi peoples fought for political dominance. The NMR, in an effort to transcend the divisive post-colonial politics of Rwandan identity, appears to have settled for a broad dismissal of ethnicity as an organizing principle in favor of a nation-building discourse of all-inclusive Rwandanness. Taken together, the papers chart a contentious history of African art and post-colonial cultural politics whose contours are still unfolding in the new century. We are heartened by the panelists' confidence in their projects and their clear devotion to a discourse of African art that centers the African continent and its history, even as it guards against essentialist narratives that thinks of Africa as a hermetic space isolated from wider global initiatives. I congratulate the authors and the panelists for their presentations, and thank you all for attending this panel.